Welcome back, YouTube. I'm Reedster with Far Gaming, and in this video, we're going to look at some conditional statements. This includes if, else, and switch case statements. We'll also sprinkle in some comparison and logic operators as well. Let's get started. So first off, I'm going to make a very basic if statement just to give you an idea of how they work. With an if statement, we open up with a set of parentheses afterwards, and then we'll put some sort of Boolean value, either true or false, or you can do a comparison. Whatever ends up in here needs to evaluate to either true or false. You can't just put numbers or things like that. It has to evaluate to true or false for an if statement to work properly. After that, you have a set of squirrely braces, and if whatever is inside the parentheses evaluates to true, then it's going to run this code. In this specific example, I wrote the word true in there, so this is going to run every single time. So there's not a whole lot of point to it. But moving down, I have a Boolean value called player is walking. This one can hold the value of either true or false, depending on if the player is walking. So if this evaluates to true, then the if statement is going to run whatever code is inside of its braces. If this evaluates to false, it is not going to run that. Now, if you have a situation where if a Boolean value returns false, that you want it to run whatever is in the if statement, you can simply use this exclamation point, which means not, and it will give you the inverse of whatever is inside the Boolean. So this is saying not false if this was false. So therefore, this entire thing right here would evaluate to true, and then it would run the code in here. You could essentially read this as if the player is not walking, then run the standing animation. In this next example, I'm using a comparison operator to say if the player speed is greater than 3, play the running animation. This statement is going to return either true or false depending on what the player's speed is. If it returns false, and now we want to check against another possible condition, that is where we would use an else if statement, which is only ran if the first statement returns false. So in the else if statement, we have another comparison that says player speed greater than 0. If this returns true, it will play the walking animation. If it returns false, it will go down to this else statement, which is kind of a catch-all. If you've made it down to the else, that means everything else has returned false, and it's going to run whatever code is inside here by default. However, just to reiterate, if at any point either the if or the else if statement returns true, whatever code is inside them will run and it will stop progressing further down. So if the if returns true, else if and else will not run this time around. We can also compare multiple conditions inside of an if statement. So here I'm saying if the player speed is greater than 5, or this is a or operator, or the player is injured, then the player breathes heavily. So only one of these two conditions needs to evaluate to true, and then the if statement will run. If both of these evaluate to false, that is when the else statement would be executed. Now, if instead of an or operator, I put in an and operator, that would say if the player speed is greater than 5 and the player is injured, then the player breathes heavily. That means both of these must evaluate to true before this code would run. So, for example, if the player speed was actually less than 5 and this evaluated to false, there's something called short circuiting where now if this evaluates to false, it's not even going to check whether this one evaluates to true or false. It's going to skip that one completely. It says this one's false. Cool, I'm not running it. I'm going straight to the else statement, and the player is going to breathe normally. But this is super useful whenever you have multiple conditions that need to be met before a certain set of lines of code are ran. So you can actually have more than two different conditions in here. I could have an and operator. I could also put in another or and put some other stuff over there. Let's say on the other side, I have player just finished holding their breath. It's not an actual variable I have, but in this case, I have an and operator and an or operator. So basically, what would happen is, so like this whole side right here would have to evaluate to true, or just this side would have to evaluate to true, and then the player would breathe heavily. Last thing on if statements is you can actually nest them inside of other if statements. So first I'm checking if the player is walking. If this evaluates to true, then this if statement inside of that one is going to run next. So it's going to say if the player is injured, play the injured walking animation, else play the normal walking animation. So these two options only come up if the player is walking. If this evaluates to false, it just skips all of this and goes straight down to the else, and it just plays the standing animation. Super useful if you need one condition to be met before you have multiple other conditions that need to be evaluated later on, such as in this scenario. Lastly, we have our switch case conditional statement. This one is really useful if you have a variable that you know what values it could potentially hold, and then depending on what that value is, you want a different thing to happen. So in my case here, I have a variable called player speed, and I've said up here that the speed will either be 0, 1, or 2. So then I come down and I make different scenarios essentially where I say, in case my player speed is 0, then play the standing animation because my player is not moving anywhere. Or in case that my player speed is 1, then play the walking animation. If it's 2, play the running animation. And then you also have a default case, which is if your variable is not equal to any of the cases that you've already set out, then what's it supposed to do by default? In this case, it just says unknown player speed and it ends there. If you notice the syntax for this one, you write the word switch, and inside the parentheses, you put whatever variable is being evaluated inside the switch statement. You'll then write the word case, and you put the first scenario of what value it could potentially hold, and you use a colon. And then right here, you could put as many different lines of code that you want to be executed if the value equals 0. So I could have it play the standing animation. I could make certain sounds play, whatever I need to happen. But what's important is once I'm done with case 0, I write the word break with a semicolon, and that's what tells my code to separate from this other scenario. Also, your case statements do not need to go in like an ascending order like this or anything. That's just the way that mine's currently set up. Let's say if instead I went with player name as the variable being evaluated, and let's say if the name was Roger, then these are the things that you would need to do. Maybe it loads a specific style for what the character looks like, whatever. And then I could have another case here for if the player's name was Gordon. So you can have different types of variables being evaluated, and you can have different cases for those different scenarios. It really just depends on how you're needing to implement this in your situation. That's all for this tutorial. Remember, if you learned something, to hit that subscribe button to catch all my latest content. It also helps me out tremendously. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.